All right, it's 10:03. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so very much for being here. I'm stopping share now. Um, my name's Nancy Walsh-Shurik with the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts, and I'm really, really excited to welcome you to this webinar on pollinators and fire. Um, we've had a lot of interest in this topic, and I wish that fire weren't such a familiar topic in California, but we all know that it is. So I think it's important to look at some of um, the benefits that we might be able to get from fire for pollinators that might not be top of mind when we're worrying about burning down. Today, as I said, we're going to be learning about how fire affects pollinators and how working with fire and wildfire prevention can help pollinators. We have three presenters today, and I'm really excited to tell you a bit about more about each of them in a few minutes. I'll be introducing them right in front of their presentations. Before we get started, there's a little housekeeping. We are recording this webinar, and the recording will be made available afterwards. The speakers have said that they will be happy to share their PowerPoints to anyone who requests them. So you can request them in the chat or send me an email after the webinar to get hold of those. Um, if you have, I wanted to let you know that just because we wanted to reduce the risk of problems with internet connections that happen sometimes, the speakers opted to record their presentations ahead of time, but be assured they are here and they will be ready to answer your questions live in the Q&A. And we will wait until the end of all three presentations before we address the Q&A. We've left ourselves plenty of time, so I think we'll be able to get through all the questions that you have, and if not, we will record them and get answers to you after the webinar. If you have any, so again, if you have questions, please use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And if you're having any technical difficulties or need to communicate something else, please feel free to send a direct message either to me or to Sarah Letton, who is from CARCDE also and is assisting today in the background so that I don't have a nervous breakdown in case something happens. So I would like to, let's see, I'm gonna get my first speaker lined up here. Sorry, I'm gonna share screens. All right, our first speaker is Lauren Panicio. Lauren is an assistant professor at the University of Oregon's Department of Biology. You can see her up there. Lauren's research revolves around preserving and restoring bee populations in agricultural areas and other natural habitats. She's interested in understanding the distribution and health of different populations of native bees. Lauren holds 2 degrees from Stanford, her bachelor's degree in biology with honors in ecology and evolution, and her master's in biology. She received her doctorate in 2016 from the Department of Environmental Science Policy and Management at UC Berkeley. Lauren served as a Moore Sloan Data Science postdoctoral fellow at the Berkeley Institute of Science from 2016 to 2017 before joining the UC Riverside Department of Entomology as an assistant professor in 2017, and then moving on to the University of Oregon in 2020. And with that, I'm going to get started on her presentation.
Hello everyone, I'm Lauren Panicio, and today I'm going to talk about pollinators and wildflowers, and specifically I'll be spending a lot of time talking about bees. So when we think of a wildfire moving through an area, we often want to know, first of all, what happens in the short term? So which species are most likely harmed by the wildfires, which are left untouched? And also in the long term, what about 5-10 years after the wildfire? What do pollinator communities look like? To understand those things, we need to know a bit about the life history of bees and pollinators, and so I'm going to start there. we have an incredible diversity of bees in North America. And in fact, we have about 1,500 to 1,700 species of bees in California alone. There's a couple hundred in Oregon as well. There are about 4,000 species in North America. There are also a whole variety of non-bees like flies and butterflies and beetles and wasps, but also vertebrate pollinators like hummingbirds and bats. In general, though, when we think of the abundance of individuals in the majority of temperate ecosystems, they tend to be mostly bees. And because bees are collecting pollen and nectar, unlike many of these are only collecting nectar or not actually purposefully collecting pollen, they tend to be the most efficient pollinators. So often we use the term pollinator and bee kind of synonymously, but that's why. In addition, the Western US is kind of like the Amazon for bees, where unlike a lot of species groups like butterflies that peak in diversity in the tropics, bees actually peak in diversity in Mediterranean environments like California or the desert Southwest, as well as Israel or Australia, South Africa. And so when we think of doing bee conservation in the US, it means that the efforts we do here are actually really important for the global diversity of bees. In addition, just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing when we think of bees, bees are vegan wasps. So they're wasps that have given up a carnivorous lifestyle and they only eat pollen and nectar. So this is a family tree of Hymenoptera, or the family of bees, wasps, and ants. And you see down at the very bottom, we have bees, which are this highly derived wasp that have given up the meat. And it's also important to understand how the bee life cycle works. The vast majority of bees are solitary. So this means they're just like regular insects. Each female mates, each female makes a nest. So this adult female will go out, forage for pollen and nectar. She'll make a nest, most often underground. We'll talk about that shortly. She'll collect a bunch of pollen, lay an egg on it. That egg will turn into a larva. The larva is what consumes the pollen ball. That larva will then turn into a pupa. The pupa usually overwinters underground until the whole cycle repeats. We also have a variety of social bees, and particularly bumblebees that are wild in the Americas. Instead of having each female mating here, we have a queen or foundress that goes out and does some foraging in the spring. She lays a couple eggs. Those eggs.
Oh no. Sorry, I'm gonna try to figure out what happened here. Okay, I'm gonna try to fast forward us so we can get back to where we were.
Hello everyone, I'm Lauren Panicio, and today I'm going to talk about at the very bottom, we have bees, which are this highly derived wasp that have given up the meat. And it's also important to understand how the bee life cycle works. The vast majority of bees are solitary. So this means they're just like regular insects. Each female mates, each female makes a nest. So this adult female will go out, forage for pollen and nectar. She'll make a nest, most often underground. We'll talk about that shortly. She'll collect a bunch of pollen, lay an egg on it. That egg will turn into a larva. The larva is what consumes the pollen ball. That larva will then turn into a pupa. The pupa usually overwinters underground until the whole cycle repeats. We also have a variety of social bees, and particularly bumblebees that are wild in the Americas. Instead of having each female mating here, we have a queen or foundress that goes out and does some foraging in the spring. She lays a couple eggs. Those eggs become her first workers. They go out and forage themselves while she continues to lay eggs. They form a whole colony. That colony then, at the end of the season, releases a couple queens as well as some males to mate, and the cycle continues. There's also the European honeybee, and the European honeybee, or Apis mellifera, is also colonial. It's a very special type of colonialism. These bees are incredibly important for agriculture. They do the majority of our industrial pollination. They are, however, non-native and were originally introduced to the Americas actually by the Pilgrims. They're quite invasive in the Americas and in fact are present on every continent beside Antarctica. and are likely more honeybee individuals today than there ever have been in the history of our planet. They compete with native bees for nutrition, so for pollen and nectar, and they tend to share parasites and pathogens. So I'm not going to be talking a lot about this bee in the talk, but I just wanted to make people aware of it. In general, when we don't see them manage colonies in those tidy white boxes, stacked on semi trucks, we see them feral up in trees or cavities, and we see those honeycomb structures like this. So sometimes you'll be walking around the forest, you'll see something like this. That's the European honeybee. In general, bees need two things: nutrition, particularly in the form of flowers, and nests, somewhere to nest. And there's incredible diversity of different nesting habits. So let's focus in on nutrition. In general, we see that bee richness and bee abundance tracks flower richness and flower abundance, and we see this in all types of different ecosystems and basically everywhere. If you have incredibly rich and abundant flower communities, you tend to have really rich and abundant bee communities. Most adult bees eat some pollen, but mostly nectar as fuel for their flight muscles. Females provision their nests with the pollen and also process nectar. So they add a bunch of interesting things to the nectar and make little like nectar soup for their young. And in the desert, they're actually oil collecting bees. Instead of collecting pollen, they collect this oil on these really specialized kind of like very, very hairy legs, and they use that to provision their nests instead. Now, thinking about nesting, the majority of bees are below ground nesters, and so they often excavate these really elaborate kind of labyrinths underground. Up in the top right corner, we have a bee that actually makes these little turrets. We also have alfalfa bees in the bottom right corner that alfalfa growers actually promote them to make their nests in areas to do pollination. My favorite bee probably is this poppy bee that actually makes these very shallow nests and lines them with petals. It's very nice. Bumblebees will often nest in just very shallow, right under the surface of the ground. They'll excavate them those cells. There's also a whole variety of below or above ground nesters, and basically anything that has a hole and could have a bee in it is nested in. So just to name a few, often we see bees nesting in beetle holes that those red arrows are pointing to. So there's an existing hole. They'll lay their eggs in kind of a really orderly, linear fashion, and they'll top it off with a little bit of mud, which you can see right there. Some bumblebees will nest in cavities, like in the top left corner. So they'll nest in like the base of trees where there's a little hole, or even within the tree itself. We also see bees like in the bottom left corner that will nest in pithy stems. And many of you have probably seen your rose bushes with those little like perfect little circles clipped out of the leaves. That's a leaf cutter bee. That's in the bottom center. And so they're the ones that are often nesting in existing holes, and they line them in leaves. Okay, so now we have a wildfire. If we think about what happens after that wildfire, we might want to think about those bees' needs. There's quite a couple labs now working a lot about western forests. There's my lab at the University of Oregon. There's Jim Kane at the USDA. He's technically retired, but still very active. There's Jim Rivers' lab at Oregon State University and Laura Burkle's lab at Montana State. So if you guys are wanting to learn more about these things, you can check out these labs, Google Scholars, and there's quite a bit going on. Okay, so we have this wildfire. What happens? Which bees dies? Which bees live? And to answer that, we can think about their needs, particularly their nesting. So we have all these below ground nesters. The soil heat horizon of fire often doesn't extend down that deep. So a lot of the really deep nesting bees will be fine, but these shallow nesting bees, like the bumblebees or this poppy bee, would definitely be killed. So they would be within that heat horizon and would be wiped out. All the above ground nesters would die. So anything that's nesting in wood or right on the shallow surfaces, they would not make it after a fire. They would have to recolonize from less severely burned or unburned patches. And then, what about, let's say, 10 years after a fire? This is actually the picture that made me want to get into understanding the effects of bees on fire, because as if you're a bee, this just seems like such an amazing place. So we think about the long-term effects of fire. You can think about studies of comparing areas with fire versus no fire. studies of thinking about fire severity. So how severe, like were all the trees killed, were just a few trees killed? Studies thinking about biodiversity, or the diversity of fire histories, salvage logging, and floral enhancements. So we're going to go through each of these in turn and the different studies that have looked at their effects. So in general, we found that fire is good. So forests burned by wildfire have higher abundance and richness of flowering plants, and therefore bees versus areas without fire. So when you think of a closed canopy forest, there's not really a lot for bees there. Whereas when we think of a forest that's experienced some kind of fire, that clears out a lot of the canopy cover, we have some space for flowering plants to grow. There was meta-analysis done on this, and they found in general that flies and bees in particular had really strong positive effects of wildfire. Butterflies and moths did not have a positive effect. That may be due to the fact that they tend to have really close relationships with their host plants. So the little larvae actually develop on a specific host plant that might be affected by a wildfire, while flies and bees are more generally dependent on floral resources, which are often increased after a fire. Also, as the forest canopy closes post-fire, that tends to lead to lower nesting success until complete nest failure once the forest is like an intact forest. And this was a really interesting study done where they put bumblebee colonies out at different ages of forest and looked at their survivorship. We think about fire severity. So we have often think about like high, medium, or low fire severity, sometimes even unburned. So this is a beautiful high severity patch full of goldenrod. You can see that entire canopy has been opened up. So there's 90% or more tree mortality. And so lots of light reaches the forest floor, lots of places for flowers to grow. There's another high severity patch. This one's turned completely into ceanothus. It was really fun to walk around in. And also lots of lupin. So once that canopy is opened up, we tend to see lots of flowering plants. Interestingly, however, when we have a really severe wildfire, this often crystallizes the phloem in trees. And so you don't see the little beetle holes that you often see in a tree that was not killed by fire, because they can't really dig in there. And so even though we see lots of dead wood, there may not be as much bee habitat as we might expect. But in general, we found that high severity fire increases bee abundance and richness. This was seen in the Oregon Cascades in the Rivers Lab. They found 20 times more individuals and 11 times more bee species than in low severity patches. We found something similar in the Sierra Nevada. We found about 3 times more floral species and 2 times more bee species. And Montana had a really similar result by the Burkle Lab. What is interesting to think about is what happens when these fires get really large. So if these bees, particularly the above ground nesters, have to recolonize these patches, what if that center of the patch is really, really far away from a less severely burned patch? And is that going to actually affect the richness of the community that develops there? So that's a project we're applying for funding on currently. We can also think of fire severity. So this is not just the severity of a local patch, but this is the diversity of fire in the surrounding landscape. So thinking of those different categories of severity and those kind of classic maps of fire severity through space. So we have a fire in 1994, it has all this diversity of severity. And then we have 2 other fires, particularly in 2001 and 2004, and they have all their different severity as well. And if we dropped a pin through these different fires, we would see that, first this one little pixel experienced a low severity fire, then a moderate, then a low. Whereas if we move over to the other side, this little pixel only experienced a low, a very low, and then was unburned. And so we can think of all these different pieces of severity, so pieces of fire history, so the severity, the timing, and the frequency. You could also imagine adding the season in places where there's more variation in season. This was in the Sierras, so fires tended to happen around the same time period when it was hot and dry in the late summer. And you can think of summing these all together until you get this kind of unique fire experience. So all the different unique ways a pixel could be burned in this landscape. kind of like transposing this over, this is actually the Illilouette Creek Basin in Yosemite National Park. It's got a whole diversity of fire histories, particularly because they allow all lightning strike fires to burn. The white patches are unburned areas, particularly granite mountains. And so we have all of this diversity of fire histories. Each color is like a unique fire history. And we could zoom in one area and say, okay, this is actually an area with very low fire diversity because you have basically the same fire experience over and over and over again. So if you were a bee in the center of that patch, it would look pretty homogeneous to you in terms of fire history. If we move over to the other side of this basin, we see areas with a really high fire diversity. So all different types of fire experiences all against each other. And so if you were a bee in the center, you'd have all this heterogeneity around you. And in general, we found that pyrodiversity or fire diversity tends to increase bee and plant richness, as well as interaction richness, so the unique pairing of bees and plants. It tends to increase bee nutrition, that was out of the Burkle lab, and in combination with diet flexibility, so the ability to sort of switch your floral interaction partners, buffers against the effect of drought. We happen to have a really crazy drought in the middle of our field sampling system, and we're able to look at that. It also tends to increase community turnover or beta diversity. Community turnover / beta diversity. Okay, so thinking about salvage logging. So salvage logging is after a fire, they go and they remove the trees that are marketable. In general, people have found that salvage logging isn't great. So there tends to be 4 times fewer species of bees, though abundance was unaffected. This was probably because floral abundance was actually unaffected. But you can imagine that, you have all of this disturbance, lots of dead wood being removed, maybe even trees were less severely burned. And so you're removing a lot of nesting habitat. And so that might limit the types of species that can survive there. There's really only been one study done on salvage logging and bees that from the Rivers Lab that controlled for fire severity as well, because you can imagine there's sort of an interaction between fire severity and salvage logging. And so this was one study done. There's also a question a lot of times about floral enhancements, particularly in areas that have experienced potentially logging or herbicide use where flowers are not naturally coming up. But there tend to be a lot of considerations. For example, what is viable in this area, as well as what is available? So what can you go out and buy? What are the characteristics of pollinator communities you want to optimize? Some options are, do you want to optimize the abundance of bees? Do you want to optimize the richness, or do you want to optimize something about the functional trait diversity of bees in your area? If you have knowledge of plant pollinator interactions, there are plant selection tools that incorporate that can optimize for different community characteristics. And as an example, my colleague Letha McGonigal has a plant selection tool that's based on a genetic algorithm. And so it can take all of these different characteristics of pollinators you want to optimize. So you could actually optimize for abundance, richness, and functional diversity all at the same time. As long as you have a plant pollinator interaction network that you can feed it, it can choose a plant list for you that would optimize those characteristics. So it's some interesting ideas. So hopefully that answers some questions about the effects of wildfire on pollinators. And with that, I would like to thank my wonderful lab for all of their help and hard work, as well as our funding agencies, including the NSF, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and the USDA, as well as all the amazing taxonomists who have so far ID'd tens of thousands of bees with me. They're just absolutely incredible, and none of this could have been done without them. With that, I'd like to thank you. I have a list of all the different studies that led to this work that I'll have up right now, as well as hopefully send out, and I'll be in the chat for questions. My internet's kind of iffy, so that's why I'll just be in the chat. And thank you so much for your time, and also feel free to email me. You can find my email on my website. I'll back up right there. And yes, looking forward to questions.
Thank you so much. That was great, Lauren. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, everybody. And also, you may be confused when you see me talking and I don't look anything like the red-haired person who is on the screen when I'm not speaking. That's my boss, Karen, I'm using our shared uh, Zoom for this webinar, and that's what's happening. I'm really happy to introduce our next speaker, who's Anne-Marie Bentz, and she'll talk about Firewise pollinator-friendly gardens. Anne-Marie is the horticulture person. Excuse me. Anne-Marie is the horticulture programs manager for the California Native Plant Society, CNPS, where she gets to spend her days supporting native plant communities and their people. She spent a decade and a half serving landscapes and watersheds with nonprofits in California and Arizona. She holds a deep passion for plants and landscapes, having served as the executive director of Rescape California, formerly Bay Friendly Landscaping and Gardening Coalition, a nonprofit educating the large-scale landscape industry throughout Northern California on planning, constructing, and maintaining sustainable landscapes. Prior to that, she was with Prescott Creeks, doing watershed planning and riparian restoration in Northern Arizona. So I will now attempt to not mess this screen share up and see if I can get to the window that I need to get to. Sorry, one sec. Okay. Okay, well, sorry about this. It's just gonna take me a minute. Best laid plans and all. Okay, here we go.
Glad to be here with you today. I'm glad to be talking about the pollinators and wildlife and the importance of California native plants around both of those. So I'm going to be going through a couple of resources and really how to think about and to layer these important topics in your built environment. My name is Anne-Marie Benz. I'm the Horticulture Programs Manager with CNPS. CNPS and I are not authorities on emergency preparedness or getting out of your home safely in those pieces, but we do have a deep interest in how these topics layer, and particularly in fire. I live in an area that it's pretty regular now that we are evacuated annually for fire. I grew up in a fire-prone area. I lived for many years in Prescott, Arizona, which had a terrible issue with fire where we lost most of our fire department. So it's very personal to me in many ways. And I started teaching firescaping years ago, and it's a continuously growing area, and it's very important. So I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to be working with CNPS. We are a nonprofit with a deep history and a lot of interest in the science behind native plants, in protecting and preserving them both in their natural habitats, but also incorporating them into the built environment, and how important that built environment is to our long-term environmental health, our stability, and to biodiversity. So why native plants? When you go to a nursery or when you go to a grower, if you're doing a large project, there are just a ton of plants. Most of them are beautiful. They come in all shapes, sizes, colors, types. It's a little bit like going to the peanut butter aisle of the grocery store, which for me can be overwhelming. Too many options. And all of these plants have something to recommend them for the most part. They all have something that they're doing that's amazing. They fit some kind of niche and they fit some kind of look. But native plants go beyond that. They're not just beautiful, they're beneficial. So they do these logical pieces where they save water, they support wildlife, they reduce harmful runoff to the waterways. In general, they're better for you, your family, your pets, your community, all of that. But one of the biggest things that they are is beneficial to biodiversity. Native plants have co-evolved with the pollinators in that area. They've grown into the cycles of weather there. They know that they're only going to have winter rains. They've grown into areas that are extremely dry, or depending on where you are in California, get extreme cold, extreme heat. They are co-evolved for that region. And so they support the biodiversity through all of that. And California is the most biodiverse spot in our nation. Even with having lost so much to growth, to environmental factors, all of that, we still have more biodiversity than any place else in our nation. And it's really important that what we choose for our built landscapes kind of support all of that, because long-term, a good biodiversity, a good ecosystem is a good place to live. It's not going to surprise anyone here that California is in drought again. I think historically we're in drought about a third of the time, and that's getting worse. With climate change, we're seeing bigger storms, we're seeing more extreme drought, we're seeing more extreme fire events, we're seeing more extreme flooding. It's all changing, and this is the May map. If I look around me where I'm at, I see September dry hills in May, and that's scary. I was driving back from a office retreat we had where we all got to meet each other for the first time in over a year, driving through hills that were frighteningly dry already. And it makes me very aware of what we have around us. The creek that I live on has gone dry twice in the last 5 years. And those are the first times it's gone dry since the USGS put in a gauge in 1958. And it's a little bit worrisome. So California, drought is our constant. And it's something that we have to be aware of and we have to plant for. And so when you go to the nursery or you go to the grower, you see a lot of drought resistant, drought tolerant type plants. And what that means in general is that they will probably survive a drought. They won't thrive. They're not going to be happy about it, but they'll probably survive it. By choosing California natives, you're probably going to have a better opportunity for them to both thrive and survive. And as we look at California native plants for fire awareness and for pollinators, I want to kind of layer some of the resources and ways to look at how to choose plants for that. Every plant burns. Every plant will burn at some point. What we're looking for are which ones will burn slower, which ones will catch on fire slower, and trying to do that through actual experience. There are a lot of stories out there about plants that you should use because they don't burn as quick, but some of those aren't real. And the idea that if you plant grass in front of a building, the fire won't be able to get to the building isn't true. I mean, it may slow it, particularly if it's well irrigated, but we have to realize that everything has the opportunity to burn. And what we're doing is choosing for the ones that are least likely to catch or to flame easily. And we want to give ourselves and everyone else the best opportunity by slowing any fire that is out there in the built environments. So Las Colitas Nursery did a fascinating thing. They literally caught plants on fire and recorded it. And they put that information out there for you to use. I'm gonna stop sharing this presentation and go over to their website just real quick. I'm gonna start a different share. We're gonna go over to right here. This is Las Pollitas' website. They have this whole chart of California native plants sorted by genus. And then they've got the varietal even and how long it took for live ignition. And if they looked at dead leaf ignition, and then some notes like this one has a 6-inch flame. Probably want to be aware of that. It also kind of catches on fire quickly. But if you choose this one, it's over 60 seconds for it to catch on fire. So I'm going to scroll slowly because I know scrolling on Zoom can be a little bit dizzying, but just to give you a concept of how many plants they did. This was a real commitment to figuring out what burned and how quickly. It's a fascinating study, and it's a way to filter how quickly these plants will catch on fire and what they'll do. This is just the A's that we're looking at in the genus. So this is one resource to figure out how quick plants burn. And I'm going to stop and go back to the presentation for a moment. We'll go back and forth a couple of times. So that's one way to look at choosing plants, native plants that don't catch on fire quite as quickly. And then we want to layer in the pollinator piece. We've all heard how important the bees are. We all know we're trying to plant for monarchs. We've been doing this at least since Silent Spring. Everybody is fairly aware that this is an important part of our health as well as the habitat that supports us. So how do we figure out what plants are good for natives in that? And there are a couple of resources. One of them is Doug Tallamy. If you haven't seen or read him, he is a terrific resource on this topic. And this is one of his charts on looking at how many butterfly and moth species, these pollinators, are dependent on each type of plant. So you can see so easily the difference between putting in an oak tree and an acacia tree and a California lilac versus a crepe myrtle. Just the intense difference between having these natives that will support biodiversity and other plants that we see often in our landscape. So California has a long history of oak trees, and there's a lot of opportunity to add oak trees. So if you have a chance to re-add oak trees into the habitat, it's a terrific thing to have. We have whole cities named after oaks, Oakland, Thousand Oaks, that don't really have that many oaks anymore. We have whole sections that have burned in recent years, and we have a lot that have been taken out to be vineyards or other uses. Some of those are also great habitat, but very little in this form competes with oak trees. So Doug Tallamy's work is one great way to look at biodiversity for pollinators, and another is through Calscape. So I'm going to stop again and reshare over in Calscape, and we're going to move over to that one. So if you don't know Calscape, it's a really powerful database in the background of native plants, particularly great for using native plants in horticulture. And you can see 7,988 native plants. Oh, let's see, I think that's in general in the state. I'm just gonna refresh it to let it, oh, it wants to say Oakland. Well, we were just talking about oaks. So if you haven't used Calscape before, you can find good native plants for your area. Just a moment. So actually in Oakland, 588 native plants. These are ones that have been verified native wild plants within a few mile radius of wherever you're at. But if you want to go a little bit deeper, you can go over to the advanced search button here. You can choose a bunch of different things depending on what your interest is, type, sun, drainage. But what we're going to go to, because we're talking about pollinators, is bee gardens, bird gardens, butterfly gardens, butterfly hosts, hummingbird gardens. There's also the ability in here, if you want to choose whether it's fragrant or not, the color, the flowering season, the height. So you could find that red spring flowering 3-foot high plant of your dreams. But right now we're looking for the plant of a pollinator's dream. And so with that, we can go over here to the 545 plants for Oakland that are good for these type of uses, good for pollinators. And you can fall in love with something like this hummingbird sage. We have found you the hummingbird sage of a pollinator's dream. But you can go in here, you can find out all about hummingbird sage. You can see a bunch of different examples of it. You can find out what it needs in the landscape. You can find out what pollinators and wildlife are dependent on it. In this case, we've got hummingbirds and bees and butterflies and moths and the whole bit. Great suite of pollinators in here. You can find out what it needs for landscaping. What is going to make it thrive? How much maintenance is it going to be? If you're putting in something into a landscape that a team is going to be maintaining, they're going to be really thrilled if you already know this piece. You can print plant signs, you can print plant labels, you can figure out what nurseries carry it. So you can find plants for wherever your project is, and then choose ones that are really good for pollinators. Or you can go the other way and find pollinators in that area, 290 species of butterflies and moths that are native to Oakland. So you can start with the species that you want to help promote and protect. You can go into the monarch here. We all know we're supposed to be supporting monarchs. And you can see their native habitat there. You can see a whole variety of them in various times of their life. And that what they really, really want is the narrow-leaf milkweed. The heart wants what it wants. The butterfly wants what the butterfly wants. And so we need narrow-leaf milkweed. So you can go into and start with the pollinator you want, go to the plant it loves, and find out all about it. And you can work your way backwards and set up a whole pollinator-friendly garden that way. So I'm going to stop sharing here and go back to the presentation and start a different share back there. So we've just gone through how to use Calscape to do it, how to use Doug Tallamy's, how to look at burn times in plants. And I've kind of layered them here to give you some examples of ways to choose native plants. So we've got this green bark ceanothus that doesn't burn for over 90 seconds, which is huge. That's a long time in fire talk. And it's got all of these that are dependent upon it. 69 likely butterfly and moth species. It's got bees, it's got birds, it's got butterflies. It's kind of like the whole package here. So if it's native to the area you're looking at, it's obviously a great plant for this combination. We've got the narrow-leaf milkweed that we just went through, and for its burn time is over 60 seconds. So a really well hydrated plant is always going to be better, but these are ones that start with a really good burn time. And butterflies, primarily monarchs, but this whole variety is possible. And then we go to a Santa Lucia fir. Again, over 60 seconds for burn time, and you get a whole different suite of potential pollinators supported by this. So just looking at a couple of options for how to look at layering these to choose the right plants. The big leaf maple, again, over 60 seconds. It's got up to 85 likely butterflies and moths that are dependent upon it. So that's a whole suite of biodiversity right there. If you have an opportunity and you're planning your habitat, your landscape, you're replacing something in it, these are a way to look at it. When you have your landscape plan and you've got something that says shrub or tree or annual, you can start filtering it through these various factors. And then CNPS likes to be very science-based. So we're actually doing more science around this, and we're doing citizen science. So I'm going to pop out one last time over to a new share and show you kind of what we're doing with it and how you could either be involved or how it might help you learn more. So we have this new program called Fire Followers, a relatively new program, and we're looking at what comes back after these big fires. After last year, after so much fire and so much devastation, what happens next? What then? So we're using iNaturalist. We have people going out into those burn areas and finding out what comes back. What comes back in the native plants, what comes back in pollinators. And you can even go into your iNaturalist and look at what people are finding if you sign up for this program. And it's amazing. I was going to put in the spreadsheet of pollinators that are coming back, but it's huge and it depends on where you are. But we are seeing everything. We're seeing the birds, the bees, the beetles, the butterflies, all of it is coming back all over. So the more we understand this, the better we can plan in the future for knowing what's going to thrive if fire does come through. I'm going to pop out one last time and back to the presentation. I know it can be a little bit dizzying to watch things go back and forth. And I just want to give you the final resource, which is I'm glad to explain more resources, to talk about native plants, to help support projects. And I'm going to be around for the follow-up Q&A after this. So I look forward to getting to know more of you.
All right, thank you so much. That was awesome. I can't believe how much I'm learning. Our next, and I'm again sorry that we can't get rid of the face that isn't mine. Our next speaker, and I'm very happy to say last but not least, is Don Hankins. He will talk about TEK around traditional burning and pollinators. Don is a professor of geography and planning at California State University, Chico. He has a BS in wildlife, fish, and conservation biology and a PhD in geography from the University of California, Davis. His interests and expertise are in the following areas: pyrogeography, ecohydrology, landscape ecology, intervention ecology, conservation, environmental policy, and indigenous stewardship. Drawing from his academic and cultural knowledge, he's particularly interested in indigenous traditional knowledge and policy, indigenous traditional knowledge and policy and their application as a keystone process to aid in conservation and stewardship. Don has also been active in policy related to indigenous stewardship, particularly as related to fire and water management. All right, so we'll go back to my struggling to find all my links.
Good morning. The opportunity to present on traditional knowledge and pollinators. My name is Don Hankins, and I'm a professor in the Department of Geography and Planning and field director for the CSU Chico Ecological Reserves. My familiarity with TEK stems from my experience as a Muco traditional cultural practitioner. I'm a weaver, a gatherer, a hunter, a fisher, and a burner. And I've been fortunate to work with many different traditional practitioners throughout my lifetime, and had the opportunity to expand that as I ventured into other areas. And in terms of traditional practices, they form the base or guide a lot of the work that I do in stewardship and conservation. So what exactly is TEK? Well, TEK can be described as traditional ecological knowledge, which is a term that a lot of people use, or it can be more broad in saying traditional environmental knowledge. And basically what traditional environmental knowledge is information that is passed down from generation to generation for people living in place and having a connection to that place. So understanding the species that are there, perhaps we're thinking about bird migrations, or we're thinking about the specific interactions between species that occur in a place. And those are just some basic examples of it. And there's a lot of different places where we can find traditional environmental knowledge. I do want to say that traditional environmental knowledge is one term that's there, and it can be applied to pretty much anybody who has multi-generation connections to place and knowledge of that particular place. And I distinguish that from indigenous knowledge in that indigenous knowledge systems are much more encompassing and obviously are specific to indigenous peoples. And when we think about that kind of knowledge system, that may span beyond kind of understanding more of like the science-based connections of things, or the physical connections that we would typically look at within the science understanding, to encompass more like metaphysical types of considerations and broader, like universal understandings of the world. And so when we think about what is TEK, it's important to also think about the opportunities that are there to move beyond what I'll say consultation that is typical for as a requirement for agencies to engage with, say, tribal people over things, and usurping this knowledge for one's own benefit. And I really, I guess, urge caution in appropriating knowledge. And to have the gift of understanding traditional environmental knowledge or indigenous knowledge is truly a gift that needs to be respected, and it still needs to be acted upon by indigenous peoples. And so I would say that there's really a broader opportunity to support the work of traditional cultural practitioners and knowledge holders by allowing for that leadership to occur by those practitioners. So where do we find TEK? Well, TEK can be found in a lot of different areas. And one of those places that we typically find some elemental understanding of TEK is through traditional stories. And when we have an understanding of traditional stories, we start to then understand the phenomena that exist within a certain landscape, maybe understanding some of the species that are associated with each other and the interactions of those species. And sometimes that also offers insights into indicators of ecological health that are understood from that perspective as well. And the next kind of area where we can find TEK is language. And as a speaker of Muko and having awareness of other indigenous languages, I'll say that indigenous languages are full of contextual and specific knowledge of place. And it's in terms of being able to interpret and understand that knowledge, it really requires a deeper knowledge base to be able to understand why certain terms and the way that those terms are put together in language really help us to understand something. And so, for instance, I think about my specific knowledge that comes from language about seasons and weather patterns and things like that that are encoded as terms within our language. And then, I think about specifics in terms of like traditional ecological knowledge and people who hold that knowledge. And it's the traditional cultural practitioners are the ones who hold that knowledge, and they spend time and place. They pay attention to changes that occur within sites where they may be gathering at, and they have maybe a long-term knowledge of that place that's really important. And when somebody is willing to share that kind of information in the field and teach about those kind of things, it's really a responsibility to absorb that information and use it respectfully and not appropriate, as I was saying earlier. And if you don't necessarily have all the pieces for TEK of a specific place, there's opportunities to start to rebuild it. And I would really say that that is something that we can find through observations in place. And if that knowledge is lacking, then pay attention to your environment. Open yourself up to that world to understand what that world is communicating to you. So now I'd like to draw a little bit on the idea of story as a way of understanding traditional environmental knowledge. And I'll draw from stories that are connected to the relationship between species and fire. And fire is a really important component of a lot of indigenous cultures in California. And kind of universally, there's what I'll call the first fire stories, which tell us about when fires burned across the landscape and made the landscape uninhabitable. And it's through that story that we can then start to understand what our responsibility is to steward within the landscape. And so from the first fire story, then we get to what I call the second fire story. And it's in that story we start to understand our responsibilities to steward the landscape and the tools that we have to bring fire into that landscape and use it as as a stewardship tool. And in some of these stories, it's the pollinators who bring us those relationships between species and plants and fire. And in the Mulek story, and also in some of the other tribal stories from California, hummingbird is one of those species that brings fire into the landscape. And in particular, there's the association between hummingbirds and the buckeye. And hummingbird put fire into the buckeye, and people then learn to use the buckeye as the drill for the fire hearth to be able to start fires with. And because of that relationship, the Anna's hummingbird has this brilliant red head, at least for the male, that is part of that kind of story that tells us about it and also its association with the buckeye. And so learning those kind of associations is really important, but obviously then we think about it on a basic level is the relationship between the buckeye and as a nectar producing plant that hummingbirds can, and other pollinators can come to. It's encoded within that story. So it's through our stories that we begin to get a foundational understanding of our kinship responsibilities and our connections to ecocultural species. And in some senses, those are linked to pollinators, such as butterflies or other species like birds that are very important to our culture that we recognize as part of that system that we interact with and have responsibility to. And we uphold that relationship between species through that accountability of ethics and development of those sorts of things that tie us back to creation and the physical existence in this present world. And it's through that understanding of our relationship to other species that we gain that responsibility to be good stewards. And when I think about that example of what good stewardship looks like, this feather belt to me represents one of those great examples. And this feather belt was collected from Chico in about 1906 and is a Machupta feather belt. And why I think it's a really good symbol for proper stewardship of the landscape and a healthy relationship with all of those beings is that it's made from milkweed. And, in this case, we think about milkweed and its relationship to monarchs and other pollinators, but then all of the resources that are found within this belt, from the fibers of the milkweed to the feathers of different species of birds, is a connection to a landscape that's being well cared for, and it's cared for all of those different species that are there that are part of that web that we have a responsibility to. And obviously that connects us to pollinators through that way. And so when I think about some of the issues that are there for that relationship and being able to maintain it, it's linked to the use of fire particularly, and how people became disconnected from landscapes and the ability to steward because of settlement and the policies that came about, and the various actions of colonizers within the landscape. And that really limited the ability to continue cultural practices such as burning as a way of having a relationship with landscape and also maintaining culture. And that also then reduces the ability to transfer traditional knowledge as part of that. And traditional knowledge transfer is typically done in an intergenerational way, where younger people are learning from older people within a family or who are apprenticing with older people within that system. And when we've then reduced the connection of people to landscapes and the knowledge transfer, it leads to unhealthy landscapes and to people. And I look at our current situation within the state, and I think that we are really at a point where we need to start bringing fire and indigenous stewardship back into the landscape to improve the health of our landscapes, but also provide that opportunity for the health of people as well. So now I'd like to transition to talk a little bit about TEK of fire, specifically for pollinator habitat. And when we think about the use of fire, it requires knowledge of how, where, when, what, why, and who. And in that kind of sense of framework, it's also important for us to understand certain characteristics like the phenological condition of plants, but also maybe thinking about the presence or absence of certain species like pollinators and whether or not they're present within that system to be able to steward for them in a way that's going to be most beneficial to them. And when we think about fire within these landscapes, some of the challenges that are there is that we currently have a lot of different invasive plants that are present within these areas. And later I'll highlight some examples of where we can restore indigenous fire and enhance habitat for pollinators. But until we get to a point where we can start to shift species back and to kind of create a better balance within that system, there's a lot of different things that we have to understand. And from an indigenous perspective, when we think about the landscapes of California, virtually every vegetation community has a relationship with fire, either them being, fire dependent from a cultural perspective, or being fire sensitive. And very few, I would say, very few of our ecosystems are as fire sensitive. And so a lot of our landscape was traditionally stewarded with fire, but each of those ecosystems has a specific range of fire return intervals to be able to provide for the various things that are needed on the cultural side. But that cultural side then also is tied to the different species of plants and animals that are found within those areas. And so then it obviously ties back then to pollinators when we think about that connection. So some of the considerations that we have around fire in its use within the landscape, obviously ties between thinking about like the fire intensity, the type of fire it is, if it's a, surface fire or if it's a crown fire or, those kind of things, how fast it moves, the season in which it occurs, and what's the spatial extent of it. And ultimately that kind of feedback mechanism that exists around the kind of creation of opportunity for biodiversity is linked to habitat structure, is connected to the mosaics of habitats that exist based on like fire frequencies and the spatial arrangement of those fires within the landscape, but also then the densities and distributions of species that are found within those areas. And fire is a really important component for providing for that greater level of diversity and biodiversity that we find within our landscapes. And I would say that in the absence of indigenous fire over the last say 200 years, we've really taken something that's so critical to the maintenance of these systems, and particularly for the pollinators. I really see this as a solution to start to restore indigenous fire in particular back to the landscape, because that is the process which this landscape has evolved with, and make the space for it so that we can provide for those species as they're needing this kind of relationship. And so some examples of where I've been able to work to restore indigenous fire include this photograph, which was taken on the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve. And in this particular place, it's hard to imagine, but roughly 15 years ago, this area that's now covered in poppies and lupins and native grasses, which are kind of dominating in this landscape, it was entirely covered in yellow star thistle. And while that species may be beneficial to certain pollinators, it doesn't really provide a large array of different needs for different species that are found there. And so when I took this photograph just a few weeks ago, and looking at the different species that are there, there were many different species of native solitary bees and so forth, as well as beetles and predators and birds using these areas. I mean, there's just a very rich arrangement of species. And how did this system come back into being as it is? Is that we've on the ecological reserve used fire as a primary tool for eradicating yellow star thistle, and the frequencies of fire in this particular case, we've burned this particular grassland almost every single winter for the past 12 years. And so the native species really have come to thrive in this place where fire is so frequent. And it's not so much about just putting fire into a place, but reading that landscape to know when it's appropriate to put fire into that place. And in February of 2020, we did a prescribed burn on this one section of black oak forest on the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve, and it was based on those traditional knowledge indicators, looking at the germination of non-native grasses and the phenology of some of our native plants, including the oaks and some of our native grasses that are in that area. And the timing was really impeccable because by the time that we burned, within a few days, a lot of our native species began to emerge. And this photograph that we see kind of as the main photograph on the slide was taken this past April. And what we see is that that entire area that burned just 1 year previously is now covered in native wildflowers. We have long-tube iris and several different species of lupins. And those irises are visited by many different pollinators. And in the upper right, we can see an example of a bee that's visiting one of these irises. So timing is everything, and we can really use fire to restore to native species dominance and benefit pollinators in that process. But it's not just prescribed or cultural burns that create pollinator habitat. And even in the case of wildfire, such as this one that was in 2017, we have lupins that have come back in and provide habitat for a variety of different pollinators, ranging from bees to butterflies. And, I think about the traditional connection to the lupins in particular, in that my elders had shared with me one of the favored larvae was harvested off of lupins and from a butterfly, and was a traditional food resource that we no longer have a connection with. And so in terms of like restoring those relationships and responsibilities, getting back to understanding those ties is really important. And with that, I'll bring it to a close. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. That was great. I'm thinking maybe the panelists can you can use turn on your video so folks can see you. Lauren had to run out, but she has we've collected the answers, the questions and answers that were posed in the Q&A for her, and so we'll read those out. We do have quite a few questions, and so I'm going to open up my window that has them in it. And just one second. Okay. All right. Let's see. Here's the first question for Lauren. Let's see. Oh, sorry, never mind. Okay, I'm curious. Here's one. I'm curious what the effects of fire on bees, about what the effects of fire are on bees during the fire. And we had an answer actually from Tanya. The fate of bees during a fire will depend on their nesting habit. If they're above ground nesters, they'll die in high severity fires. Below ground nesters may survive if their nests are deep enough. The adults will likely be either killed by the fire or emerge to find no floral resources left, and then either try to fly to where are some where there are some flowers left or die trying. Oh, and this is from Lauren. Sorry to Tanya. It's difficult to prove, but most assume that the bee community that show up the year after a fire are mostly those that recolonize, and some below ground nesters have survived. All right, now this is a question to all the panelists. For study design, is photo ID of pollinators as reliable as trapping and vouchering insects? Which method do you prefer? Dawn or Anne, do either of you have an answer? If not, I do have one from Lauren.
I'm afraid that's not in my area of study. Don, do you know?
You know, I tend not to use voucher specimens in the work that I do, but I know for certain types of identification, it's necessary to have those kind of samples. I tend to take pictures, and a lot of the areas where I work, particularly with Indigenous communities in Australia, you know, I'm not allowed to actually remove things from those communities. So photographs are the way that I go. But sometimes you can find you know, examples of that species. And, you know, for instance, if you have a water body nearby or something, you might find bees floating on a pool, for instance, or those kind of things. So yeah, I know that Lauren had provided a response to that question in the chat, though.
Okay, thanks. And yeah, and certainly with regard to monarchs, you're not allowed to handle them at all. So we only take pictures when we're trying to identify them. So Lauren's response to that question was photo ID is very difficult to impossible for most species, but you can get to functional groups pretty well, like bumblebee, etc. ID via iNaturalist has gotten better, particularly because John Asher, an expert bee taxonomist, IDs the photos in his spare time. She says, we capture and kill all our specimens, then spend some time IDing them to species with the help of taxonomists. And then she says, the Xerces Pocket Guide is useful for characterizing by species group from photos. And we have a link. I'm thinking, Sarah, maybe you can put that in the chat if you haven't done that already. Here is let's see. This is another question for Lauren. I'm gonna move down to the questions. Sarah, can you help me out on I'm in the Google Doc, and I am wondering if these questions were all for Lauren.
Hey, Nancy. It's hard to say at this point. They were kind of rolling in. So I think let's go ahead and put them to the current panelists.
Okay,
And if
all
not,
right.
go ahead and read the response, and I'll keep
Okay,
asking.
great. Actually, and I see a couple, you know, I'm going to skip over to what I'm seeing, some new ones that I'm seeing. So this one's from Hannah. Does seasonality of prescribed burning affect bee population recovery following fire? Fall burning versus winter or spring burning? I think you kind of alluded to this, Dawn.
Yeah. I don't really look at populations of bees in particular, but I can say that, you know, when I look at fire effects from prescribed burns and wildfires that I've monitored and you know, done observations on, generally with the prescribed burns in particular that are taking place in the fall and during the winter months, typically prior to the germination period of a lot of our native, you know, annual forbs and even perennials, the pollinators tend to you know, be able to survive that because there's you know, ready nectar sources and so forth that are there for them when the flowering season does come about. And even with prescribed burning in you know, in like a ponderosa pine forest and so forth, I actually really started to notice this even more this particular year, burning on my own property, where some of the ground nesting bees emerged after the fire. And so by burning off some of the duff and so forth and litter on the forest floor, some of the ground nesting bees were able to emerge, you know, unscathed by that fire. Timing, I think, is really important. And I think that's one thing that's really difficult, you know, when we just say fire, the question that comes to my mind is, well, what kind of fire are we talking about? Are we talking about a high severity wildfire? Or are we talking about a prescribed burn that might be under cooler conditions, or even wildfires that are burning under cooler conditions? They're going to generate different effects, on different populations of wildlife in their outcome. So really important to think about that.
Thanks, Dawn. And Anne Marie, did you have anything to add?
No, I think Dawn covered it really well.
Okay, great, thanks. Another question, many people have been asking me how the heavy smoke during wildfires affects pollinators. Can anyone shed any light? She says, I apologize if this was covered already. She's particularly interested in monarchs, but also in bees and bats and birds, etc.
We haven't looked at the during. We're looking pretty closely at the right after. Do you know, Dawn?
In terms of insects, I don't have data on that. I do have observational, kind of experiences of bird impacts from heavy smoke, and in particular, thinking back to the lightning complexes in 2008 when we had really heavy smoke in this particular area. I'm in the Lassen foothills, and during that time period, the smoke was so heavy that some of the birds got, they were trying to find places where they weren't in the smoke, and I ended up finding several of them on my own property. In general, I think a lot of times, if animals have the ability to move outside of that area, and then like this last year with the North Complex fire here in Butte County, there were so many different species of birds and other insects and so forth that had moved into the area from outside of the footprint of that fire, that they were able to survive it. Heavy smoke is definitely, something I think that we have to be aware of. Obviously, it impacts us, it impacts other organisms, but in general, I think on the lighter side of things, smoke is something that, on the traditional knowledge side, fumigate and protect populations by the use of that smoke. In fact, I've got an article that will be coming out in Bay Nature this summer issue that talks about some of the beneficial aspects of smoke through traditional applications. But that's kind of the insight that I'll share on.
Great, thank you.
That's kind of what we saw in Sonoma too, actually, Dawn, I'm in the Sonoma coastal area, and when the fire started here and we started seeing the smoke, all of a sudden the birds were flying down the creek. It was one of our big indicators that it was time to leave. And then even when we came back after being out for a week and a half, it was silent. We weren't seeing pollinators, we weren't seeing birds when the smoke was really heavy. So they were either out of the area or had gone to ground.
Thank you. Let's see, there was one other question. This one was aimed at Lauren from Gigi. Let's see. Do you know how bee community diversity and abundance changes over time after fire, like 1 year versus 5 years? Also, I saw on your website you also work in agriculture. Do you work with farmers on pollinator fire issues? If so, how do farmers seem to respond? And here is her response. Pollinator richness and abundance increases with time since the fire until the canopy starts to close again. We were working in areas 10 years post-fire in the Sierras, and there were still plenty of bees. We do work with farmers, and there are mixed reactions. The almond industry, for example, doesn't care too much about native pollinators because they rely so much on honeybees. And then let's see. I think this is also from her. We have a survey of almond growing coming out shortly that asks why they don't or do friendly bee practices, which is usually driven by concerns about honeybees. In general, the places that need the most pollination have little habitat for native bees, so they rely mostly on honeybees. Oh, I think she said that in her presentation. Some industries where native bees are much better pollinators than honeybees are more open to non-honeybee options, like blueberries and red clover, etc. I don't think I see any other questions. Sarah, do you think I've missed anything?
I think
And
you got them all.
all right, and panelists, is there anything else that you'd like to share? We've got a few more minutes.
I think unfortunately, we're probably going to have a lot of opportunity this fall to do more of this type of learning.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's very true. But at least on the bright side, we know that there are native species um, that are going to be okay with this, and let's just hope that they are. Thanks everyone so very much for attending the webinar, and thanks so much to the panelists. If you have other questions, please feel free to email me. I'm going to put my email in the chat just in case people haven't already seen it. Let's see if I can type it without messing up too much. All right, that should do it. Thanks very, very much, all of you. And it was really, I hope that everyone else learned as much as I did. Thanks.
All right.